I was asked to come to the Columbus College of Art and Design and talk about lipstick traces, and so I'm going to do that tonight. What I'm going to do is I'm going to read from the beginning of the book just to set up the discussion. Then I'm going to talk about research. This is a book that took 9 years. I had no idea when I started out what kind of labyrinth I was going to get lost in. And I want to talk about the research that shaped the book, just because it might be interesting to talk about research as such. And I want to talk too about the way in which certain events that the book chronicles or dramatizes have been reappearing lately in the last year or so. And simply try to orchestrate, present what the book is and the world that it attempts to excavate and describe. It's kind of tricky. It's very difficult sometimes to talk about one's own work without saying essentially how wonderful you are, which is not really what I want to talk about, or true. But we're going to start by seeing a video of the Sex Pistols performing Anarchy in the UK in 1976, because that's where the book begins. From inside a London tea room, two well-dressed women look with mild disdain at a figure in the rain outside. "It's that shabby old man with the tin whistle," says one, and a battered fedora pulled down over his eyes. The man is trying to make himself heard. "I am an Antichrist." "It is," reads the caption to this number of Ray Lowry's comic strip chronicle of the adventures of has-been, would-be pop savior Monty Smith. 17 long years since Monty was spotted in the gutter outside Malcolm McGregor's sex and drug shop. Well, years long enough, but as I write, Johnny Rotten's first moments in Anarchy in the UK, a rolling earthquake of a laugh, a buried shout, and then hoary words somehow stripped of all claptrap and set down in the city streets, "I am an Antichrist," they remain as powerful as anything I know. And listening to the record today, listening to the way Johnny Rotten tears at his lines and then hurls the pieces at the world, recalling the all-consuming smile he produced as he sang, listening today, my back stiffens and I pull away even as my scalp begins to sweat. When you listen to the Sex Pistols, to Anarchy in the UK, and Bodies and tracks like that, Pete Townsend of The Who once said, what immediately strikes you is that this is actually happening. This is a bloke with a brain on his shoulders who's actually saying something he sincerely believes is happening in the world. And he's saying it with real venom and real passion. And it touches you, and it scares you, and it makes you feel uncomfortable. It's like somebody saying, the Germans are coming, and there's no way we're going to stop them. This is just a pop song, a would-be, has-been hit record, a cheap commodity. And Johnny Rotten is nobody, an anonymous delinquent whose greatest achievement before that day in 1975, when he was spotted in Malcolm McLaren's sex boutique on King's Road in London, his greatest achievement in life up to that moment had been to occasionally irritate people he passed on the street. The record is a joke, and yet the voice that carries it was something new in rock and roll, which is to say something new in post-war popular culture. A voice that denied all social facts, and in that denial affirmed that everything was possible. And this remains new because rock and roll has not caught up with it. Nothing like it had been heard in rock and roll before, and nothing like it has been heard since. Although for a time, once heard, that voice seemed available to anyone with the nerve to use it. For a time, as if by magic, the pop magic in which the connection of certain social facts with certain sounds creates irresistible symbols of the transformation of social reality. For a time, that voice worked as a new kind of free speech. In countless new throats, it said countless new things. You couldn't turn on the radio without being surprised. You could hardly turn around. And today, those old voices sound as touching and scary as they ever did, partly because there's an irreducible quality in their demands, and partly because those voices are suspended in time. The Sex Pistols were a commercial proposition and a cultural conspiracy, launched to change the music business and make money off the change. But Johnny Rotten sang to change the world. So did some of those who, for a time, found their own voices in his. And in the small body of work they left behind, you can hear it happen. Listening, you can feel yourself responding. This is actually happening. But the voices remain suspended in time because you can look back and say, this actually happened. By the standards of wars and revolutions, the world didn't change. We look back from a time when, as Dwight D. Eisenhower once said, things are more like they are now than they ever were before. One of his most gnomic pronouncements. And against the absolute demands briefly generated by the Sex Pistols, the absolute demands that everything change, nothing changed. The shock communicated by the demands of the music becomes a shock that something seemingly so complete, could finally pass almost unnoticed in the world of affairs. This was actually not happening. Music seeks to change life. Life goes on. The music is left behind. That's what's left to talk about. The Sex Pistols made a breach in the pop milieu and the screen of received cultural assumptions governing what one expected to hear and how one expected to respond. And because received cultural assumptions are hegemonic propositions about the way the world is supposed to work, that is, their ideological constructs perceived and experienced as if they were natural facts, that breach in the pop milieu opened up into the realm of everyday life, the realm where the milieu where commuting to work, doing one's job in the home or the factory, the office or in the mall, going to the movies, buying groceries, buying records, watching television, making love, having conversations, not having conversations, making lists of what to do next, the milieu in which we all actually live. Judged according to the demands it made on the world, the Sex Pistols record had to change the way a given person performed his or her commute, which is to say that the record had to connect every act to every other, and then call the enterprise as a whole into question. That way, the record would change the world. And Elvis Costello recalled how this had worked back when he was still Declan McManus, a computer operator waiting for his train to central London. It was the 2nd of December in 1976, the day after the Sex Pistols appeared on television, on a television talk show to promote the record that was to change the world. God, did you see the Sex Pistols on TV last night? On the way to work, Elvis Costello said, I was on the platform in the morning and all the commuters were reading in the papers when the Pistols made headlines and said, "Fuck" on TV. It was as if it was a major event in history. Well, it's a mistake. It was as if it was a major in history, as if it was the most awful thing that ever happened. It's a mistake to confuse it with a major event in history, but it was a great morning just to see people's blood pressure going up and down over it. It was an old dream come true, as if the Sex Pistols, or one of their new fans, or the commuters beside him, or the television itself had happily recovered a formula conceived in 1919 in Berlin by the Dadaist Walter Mehring. And then, as if the TV or the Sex Pistols or one of their fans or the commuters tested the formula to the letter, word for word, except for the name of the game. This is what Walter Mehring wrote in 1919. What is Dadayama? Dadayama is to be reached from railroad stations, only by a double somersault. Hic salto mortale, now or never, Dadayama makes the blood boil. Lichen rages the crowd in the melting pot, partly bullfight arena, partly red front meeting, partly National Assembly, 1/2 gold plate, 1/2 silver-plated iron, plus surplus value over eternity equals everyday life. Echoing each other across half a century, Elvis Costello and Walter Mehring raised the question that shapes this book. Is it a mistake to confuse the Sex Pistols moment with a major event in history? And what is history anyway? Is history simply a matter of events that leave behind those things that can be weighed and measured? New institutions, new maps, new rules, new winners and losers? Or is it also the result of spectral connections between people long separated by place and time, but somehow speaking the same language? To fix a precious disruption, why is it that both Walter Mehring and Elvis Costello find themselves talking about train platforms and blood pressure? The happenstance of specific words in common is an accident, but it might suggest a real affinity. Two men talking about the same thing, looking for words to make disruption precious, that may not be an accident at all. If the language they are speaking, the impulse they're voicing, has its own history, might the history of that voice, might the history of that impulse tell a very different story than the one we've been hearing all our lives? There's an alchemy at work, an unacknowledged legacy of desire, resentment, and dread has been boiled down, melted down to yield a single act of public speech that will, for some, overturn what they've taken for granted, what they thought they wanted, what they decided to settle for. And it turned out, a tangled story. This book is about a single serpentine fact. Late in 1976, a record called Anarchy in the UK was issued in London, and this event launched a transformation of pop music all over the world. Made by a four-man band, rock and roll band called the Sex Pistols, and written by singer Johnny Rotten, the song distilled in crudely poetic form a critique of modern society once set out by a small group of Paris-based intellectuals. First, the group gained its greatest notoriety in the French Revolt of May 1968, when the premises of its critique were distilled into crudely poetic slogans and spray-painted across the walls of Paris, after which the critique was given up to history and the group disappeared. And this group looked back to the Dadaists, who made their names during and just after the First World War, to the young Karl Marx, to various medieval heretics, and even the Knights of the Round Table. And my conviction is that such circumstances are primarily odd. For a gnomic, Gnostic critique dreamed up by a handful of left-bank cafe prophets to reappear a quarter century later to make the charts, and then to come to life as a whole new set of demands on culture, this is almost transcendently odd. I had an impulse to write about this stuff, to write about that record. I had no idea why it was so powerful. I knew something about pop music. I knew something about its history. There was nothing I knew that explained, that made sense of the power of that record, the demands in it, the fact that somebody would get up on a pop record that was issued to be bought by ordinary people with the very first line, "I am an antichrist," with the whole sense of the entire history of Christianity and all of the heretics that accompanied it from its beginning to the present day, crashing down into a single line. Where did this come from? What was this about? Now, I began to poke around. I had no idea where to look. I had no one to ask. There was always something about the Sex Pistols that reminded me of May 68. May 68, when a trivial protest at a campus near Paris over whether or not girls and boys could visit each other in each other's rooms turned into a conflagration that for 6 weeks, close to 2 months, absolutely convulsed France, brought the government to the verge of dissolution. It was one of the first, if not the only, wildcat general strike in history where within a few weeks, millions upon millions of students and workers quit their jobs, quit going to school, occupied their workplaces, occupied their schools, turned them into centers for debate and critique with people who had never before in their lives spoken before a group of people standing up to say what their lives were about, what they wanted out of the world, why the world had to change, why it was a fraud, why truth had to be told, where truth could be found, an absolute riot of free speech on top of and below all the other kinds of riots that made the papers all over the world. Something about the Sex Pistols reminded me of that, and I had no idea what it was. So I began to read books on May 68, and I came across one called May 68 in Film Culture. I can't for the life of me remember why that looked worth reading. But I started reading it, and in this book were quotations from two writers, two books that I'd never heard of. One was by Guy Debord, and it was called The Society of the Spectacle. One was by Raoul Vaneigem, and it was called The Revolution of Everyday Life. And in the footnotes, I found out that these books were published in 1967, and I began to look for them. And they were hard to find. There were no official, legitimate publications of those books outside of France in English. Ultimately, I came across them, and I began to read them. And I will never forget riding on a plane to Europe, reading Society of the Spectacle, very short book by Guy Debord, made up of 200 and some short little passages called theses. Thesis 1, Thesis 2, Thesis 194. And I felt like I was listening to Anarchy in the UK. I felt like I was listening to all the records the Sex Pistols made, from Anarchy in the UK to Holidays in the Sun, their critique of the whole idea of the vacation. I want to go to the Berlin Wall. That sounds like a good place to go for a vacation. That's what that song was about. As if I was listening to all the records that had come out of the Sex Pistols records. A critique of modern life that called everything into question. Music that was made out of doubt, and music that itself was doubt. Music where the lines of the different elements of the music, whether it was the rhythm, whether it was the melodies, whether it was the way a line was sung or spoken, contradicted every other, where everything was called into question. And I felt as if I was reading the specific social critique that these records either made or were groping toward. I was reading it all 10 years before the fact in this obscure book of Hegelian philosophy by someone I'd never heard of. So I began to poke farther. I came across a book called Leaving the 20th Century, and it was the first collection in English of writings by this group, the Situationist International, which was a group that Guy Debord and others had founded in 1957. And it was a group that began immediately to publish a journal, and over the next 11 years published only 12 numbers of this journal. But in this journal was a critique of extraordinary humor, of extraordinary venom and viciousness, a critique that seemed so full of disgust and loathing for modern society that it was almost hard to believe that the people who were writing it believed what they were saying. And yet the writing carried a charge of relentlessness, of no surrender, of not caring what anybody made of it. It was a kind of noise. It was critical writing as noise. And this journal was decorated by pictures of cut out of Playboy, of comic strips. Everything about it was unlikely. In this book, Leaving the 20th Century, there was a little history of the Situationist International, and the writer, Christopher Gray, he mentioned the group that had come before it, the Lettrist International, whatever the hell that meant. And he said that they were best known for an event that took place in Paris in 1950 when a group of renegade lettrists, and we're talking about groups of 5, 6, maybe 8 people. So to think of a renegade group within that, you know, that's really getting into the splits and divisions that, you know, have characterized leftist or cult politics for the last 200 years, a renegade group of lettrists had invaded Notre Dame in Paris during Easter High Mass, and one of them was dressed as a Dominican monk, and they attempted to disrupt the service, and they were immediately arrested. Something about this vague little description got me going. The way this book took shape, it was simply trip, stumble, and fall. Run into something, fall down in the street, get distracted by the patterns of the concrete, and decide to go study concrete. That's pretty much was the structure of the kind of research I did. So I went to the University of California Library, and I went into the microfilm room, and I began to read the papers in Paris around Easter 1950 to see if this strange little event had made the papers. It had made the papers. It made the papers all over the world. It even made the papers in the United States, and I will never forget the description in the New York Times. It was just a paragraph, Easter around the world. And it talked about how in Paris, some people were distracted in their attempts to show off their Easter finery by an odd event that had taken place in Notre Dame. But in Paris, this was front page news. This was overwhelming. This was the scandal of scandals. What had happened was a lot richer than anything I had read. People were arguing about this in the papers for weeks at a time. What happened was that a small group of, in fact, renegade lettrists decided to break into Notre Dame. One of them was going to dress up as a Dominican monk. He was even going to have his head shaved, leaving a tonsure around his head. And he was, during a pause in the service, he was going to get up on the altar place, and he was going to stand behind the podium, and he was going to begin to deliver a sermon on the death of God. And he stood up with 10,000 people in Notre Dame for Easter High Mass, and he began, "Verily, I say to you, God is dead." And the Swiss guards in place in Notre Dame rushed the podium, attacked him, grabbed him, threw him to the ground before he had a chance to deliver the rest of his sermon, slashed him with a knife. They drew their swords. The others immediately ran out of the cathedral. Two of them were caught. Another was stabbed. They were taken to jail, but no one knew what to charge them with. You know, he hadn't even gotten into it yet. The blasphemy hadn't really happened. He was making a philosophical argument. So they took the leader of the group. His name was Michel Moore, the one who was dressed as a Dominican monk and who was going to deliver the sermon. They had him examined by a psychiatrist. And the psychiatrist produced his report. And he said that he had the ability to travel within an instant from the present to the past. That was kind of interesting. He was orthosexual, which I assume meant heterosexual. And that while he did not pose a general danger to public safety, he was likely to cause disruptions in middle-class neighborhoods. And that was really too much. You know, middle-class neighborhoods, not working-class neighborhoods. So they let him go. And I became utterly fascinated by this. I thought, what is going on? What is this all about? You know, I'm reading André Breton, the leader of the Surrealists, saying that this is what he always wanted to do when he was younger. And Michel Moore was really his son, his spiritual son. All these old Surrealists were hovering around these new young rebels, if that's what you want to call them, and saying, they're doing just what we said they ought to have done. They wanted to claim this event as their own. So I kept stumbling, and I would go into the stacks at the university library and look for books on France in 1950, and I came across one. It had the wonderful title, La Jeunesse à la demi-siècle, the youth at the half-century. I love that phrase, the half-century, as if, you know, we talk about the century turns, the turn of the century. Well, the French had cut that up. Something special was supposed to happen at the half-century. Things were supposed to begin to break up. And in this book, I read a reference to a book that Michel Moore, the person who had fomented this event, had written about it. It's called Malgré le blasphème, In Spite of Blasphemy. And I got a hold of this book and I read it. It was the most extraordinary spiritual autobiography or autobiography of a fuck-up I had ever read. It was absolutely startling in every way and ends with the Notre Dame event. And it was written by a penitent, by someone who had recanted, by someone who said, I have always sought God. I have always sought a higher authority. And now I have found it. I had to go through the trial of fire of blasphemy in order to find God and accept his love. In other words, he wrote a book that was so acceptable to the church that a priest wrote the introduction to it. Now, we have seen, just in the last year, this event take place again twice. First was Pussy Riot, going into the cathedral in Moscow to recite their punk prayer. And we're going to look at a video of their performance, of their disruption in the cathedral in Moscow. But first I want to read you the sermon that Michel Moore was going to deliver and the punk prayer that Pussy Riot, in fact, delivered in the cathedral in Moscow. Today, Easter Day of the Holy Year, here under the emblem of Notre Dame of Paris, I accuse the Universal Catholic Church of the lethal diversion of our living strength toward an empty heaven. I accuse the Catholic Church of swindling. I accuse the Catholic Church of infecting the world with its funereal morality and of being the running sore on the decomposed body of the West. Verily I say unto you, God is dead. We vomit the agonizing insipidity of your prayers, for your prayers have been the greasy smoke over the battlefields of our Europe. Go forth then into the tragic and exalting desert of a world where God is dead, and till this earth anew with your bare hands, with your proud hands, with your unpraying hands. Today, Easter Day of the Holy Year, here under the emblem of Notre Dame of France, we proclaim the death of the Christ God so that man may live at last.
Черные рясы, золотые погоны, все прихожане ползут на поклоны, призрак свободы на небесах. И правда отправит Сибирь готова! Глубоко губы, главный седой, ведет протестующих снова конвой, чтобы святейшего не оскорбить. Женщина может рожать и любить! Страсть, страсть, страсть Господня, страсть, страсть, страсть Господня, страсть, страсть, страсть Господня, страсть, страсть, страсть Господня.
Well, you can see that's a video put together to dramatize this event, but I don't have to read their punk prayer because it was right there in the subtitles, which I hadn't seen in the video. This event caused much worse consequences for the 3 women involved, the 3 women of Pussy Riot, than it did for Michelle Moore. They were sentenced, as I'm sure you all know, to 2 and 3 years in prison. 1 was released, but 2 remain in prison. We're going to see a little, a 1-minute interview with President Putin on this event, which is one of the classic pop moments of our time.
Okay, and I'd like to talk about the trial and jailing of Pussy Riot, that punk group band. There's been much criticism that the sentence handed down was too strong, was too much, and the whole case was just made too big a deal of. In fact, it actually backfired, and it's brought more people to their cause with the publicity. With hindsight, so it was a beautiful thing, but with hindsight, do you think that the case could have been handled differently?
Could you please translate the name of the band into Russian?
Pussy Riot, the punk band. I don't know what you call them in Russian, sir. Maybe you could tell me.
Can you translate the first word into Russian? Or maybe it would sound too obscene. Yes, I think you wouldn't do it because it sounds too obscene, even in English.
I actually thought it was referring to a cat, but maybe I'm missing a point here. But anyway, sir, do you think that the case was handled wrongly in any way? Could some lessons be learned?
I know you understand it perfectly well. You don't need to pretend you don't get it. It's just because these people made everyone say their band's name too many times. It's obscene, but forget it.
I mean, the idea of the president of Russia, the virtual dictator of Russia, saying, you can't pretend you don't get it. So that was one event. That was one cataclysmic event that's going to have consequences in Russia and around the world for a long time to come, as the Notre Dame event did. Because for the people who formed the Lettrist International in 1952, and the people who formed the Situationist International in 1957, and for Johnny Rotten, who in his own way with Anarchy in the UK, with beginning a song with I Am an Antichrist, restaged the protest, the disruption, whatever you want to call it, in Notre Dame in 1950, restaged it on a 7-inch piece of plastic. As that event had consequences, this will too. One of them happened immediately after the election of Pope Francis this spring. This took place, again, in Notre Dame in Paris. It was a group called Femin. Femin is a punk group of activists, writers, critics, and performers that are based in the Ukraine, but are active all over Europe. They, most recently, just last week, shouted down Putin at a gathering in the Netherlands. There is a video of one of them in the Ukraine, a very long video because it takes the woman in the video a long time to saw a huge wooden cross in half. They are an anti-clerical, blasphemous punk group of performers, and this is what happened in Notre Dame in Paris immediately after the election of Pope Francis this year. I'm just thinking about Michelle Moore coming up with, well, what if we got a bunch of women to go into Notre Dame half naked and ring the bells? What about that? I don't think he would have thought of that. Well, immediately after this remarkable event, with women coming in with slogans painted all over their backs, Pope Francis, go away. Pope Francis, quit now. An article appeared in one of the Paris papers, and it said, this was the headline, "Forget Femin. Here's the real Notre Dame scandal." And they published a long article about the Notre Dame scandal in 1950 with led by Michelle Moore, drawn almost completely from stuff in this book. And I read that article, and I was appalled. Forget Femin. Let's go back to the real thing. It's like some baby boomer saying about Woodstock, well, you really should have been there. It completely missed the point. The point is not to compare one historical event to another and find the present wanting compared to the legendary past. The point is to look at wonder, at the way in which events repeat themselves, in the way in which, and to wonder how that happens. Now, I don't know, it wouldn't occur to me that the women in Femin or the women in Pussy Riot knew about what Michelle Moore did. Maybe they did, maybe they didn't. But it's better that they didn't. It's better that the impulse to go into a cathedral and stage a blasphemy so outrageous that nobody knows what to make of it, that people are left dumbfounded, that is an impulse that ranges through at least the last century. There was a Dada event in Berlin Cathedral in 1922 that was almost the same, when a Dadaist named Johannes Bader stood behind the altar, again crashed the party, crashed the service, and got up and made a speech that no one took down, that he pulled out of the air, and it has about 15 different versions, such as, I hate Christ, Christ is a phony, the church is a fraud, or my favorite, Jesus is a bratwurst. And, you know, that's one of the great things about Dada. You get to choose. There's no definitive history. There are many versions of every single event. You get to choose which one you like. Well, one of the things that struck me watching Pussy Riot and watching Femin, listening to them chant, listening to the musical chant, to the song that Pussy Riot put together, and listening to the slogans and chants of Femin, is that when you go back and you listen to the first European and British punk records made by all-female groups, by the Slits in England, by Kleenex in Zurich, this is what they sound like. They are yelps, they are screams, they are shouts, they're playground noises, they're unmediated female noises that had never been heard in pop music before. And they were just as shocking on records in 1977 and 1978 as these events are shocking today. And they are speaking the same language. It is a language of a certain kind of liberation. When people have been freed from the roles they thought they had to play, from the way they had to talk, from the things they were permitted to talk about, freed maybe by a record like Anarchy in the UK, or when they have freed themselves from the shibboleths and restrictions and ideologies that have been wrapped around them all their lives, and they have said, inspired by punk, as Pussy Riot surely was, inspired by punk, as Femin were, but maybe in a much more tangled manner, I don't know, when they freed themselves and they said, no, this is not the way we're going to act anymore, this is not the way we're going to speak anymore, this is not what we're going to talk about anymore. We're going to try and find a new language. And that language is going to be made of gestures. It may require wearing masks. It may require taking clothes off. It may require painting slogans on our bodies. But we are going to go out into the public space. Making a record, getting it on the radio is a kind of act in a public space. Invading a church, obviously that is an act in a public space. We're going to go out in the public space and we're going to act as free people. And we're going to say to people, you haven't seen this before, you have to wonder what it is. Now, all this book is an attempt to trace a voice, to trace the way this voice puts itself together. And it has all kinds of beginnings. The beginnings that some of the actors in this book, particularly people like Guy Debord, who once wrote, after the, writing The Society of the Spectacle, writing all kinds of very dense theorizing based on the early writings of Karl Marx, really digging down to the basis of modern Western society and finding the rot at its foundation and trying to find a way to increase the rot, to make it even more rotten so that it would fall to pieces. That was the fantasy project of the Situationist International. The group that people like Guy Debord looked back to when he wrote, as I was saying, long after he wrote Society of the Spectacle, when he said that this revolt, this attempt to take modern society apart, to challenge all of its assumptions, and to defeat all of its assumptions, began with modern poetry, began with the way modern poetry attacked knowledge, attacked what we think we know, attacked what we think is the truth, and did that by attacking the word itself. That's where Guy Debord said this voice began. It began, maybe one can say most conveniently, maybe one can say truthfully, it began at the Cabaret Voltaire in Zurich in 1916. That's where the Dadaists first came together. That's where they took that name. That's where a bunch of out-of-work, starving artists who had come to Zurich to escape conscription in Germany or Romania or France, in other words, they were draft dodgers, excuse me. Dodge drafters, that has a nice ring to it. They were Dodge drafters hiding out in Zurich. They were artists. They were poets. They were visual artists. And they decided to form a nightclub to make some money so they could live. And they opened a place called the Cabaret Voltaire, named after Voltaire, the Prince of Doubt, a person who decided he was going to set out to doubt everything. He was going to doubt whether or not he even existed. And that's where his famous "I think, therefore I am" came from. That was after a long period where he successfully doubted everything, including whether he existed, and then finally came to the conclusion that he did. And I'll read you a description of the Cabaret Voltaire by Hans Arp, one of the founding members, one of the founding six. On the stage, a gaudy, motley, overcrowded tavern. There's several weird and peculiar figures representing Tristan Tzara, Marcel Janko, Hugo Ball, Richard Hulsenbeck, Madame Emmy Hemmings, and your humble servant. Total pandemonium. The people around us are shouting and laughing and gesticulating, and our replies are sighs of love and volleys of hiccups, poems, moos, and the meowing of medieval bruitis, noisemakers. Zara is wiggling his behind like a belly of an oriental dancer, and Janko is playing an invisible violin and bowing and scraping. Madame Hennings, with a Madonna face, is doing the splits. Holzenbeck is banging away nonstop at the great drum, with Ball accompanying him on the piano, pale as a chalky ghost. Every night they did something like this. Every night they tried to top what they had done before. And they began, like the women in Pussy Riot, to put on masks. Masks that were made to resemble their actual features, but completely distorting them so that they looked like bomb victims or people who'd been half burned in fires. And at one point, Hugo Ball, who was the founder of the Cabaret Voltaire, and in many ways its leader, began to experiment with poetry. And he began to perform poems that made no sense, that were not in any recognizable language, that nobody could understand, and yet that anybody could understand because of the fervor behind the way he delivered the words, because of the way in which he threw his whole body into it and made you understand that something tremendous was at stake, and you wanted to know what it was, and you realized that what was at stake was so powerful and so threatening and so dangerous that it couldn't be put into ordinary language. The poet himself couldn't do it because he was afraid of what he might say. And nobody would be ready to hear what he had to say if it was presented in ordinary language. So it had to be presented in a kind of code, and yet a code that went right to the heart of people listening to it. Many years later, this was 1916. Sometime in the 1980s, there was a television show called Ripley's Believe It or Not, based on the comic strip that had run for, God knows, centuries in American newspapers, where they found oddities, you know, a squid that ate a banana, or a dolphin with 3 heads, or whatever it might be. Believe it or not. And the producer of the show was a poet, and he decided he wanted to do a whole show about sound poetry. And he was going to make it a survey of sound poetry across the world, because since Dada, sound poetry had become a recognizable genre, a school. Many people practiced it. And he opened it with a film restaging Hugo Ball delivering his poem, his first sound poem called Caravane, in the Cabaret Voltaire. He's wearing this bizarre, enormous costume made out of cardboard where he's dressed, as he described it, as a medieval bishop, but his hands are flippers, and he's dressed in gold and red, and while he's reading his poem, he's flapping his arms that are encased in these huge cardboard wings as if he's just about to take off, and they show this film, and then they bring out the host of the show, the person who introduced every week of the show, Marie Osmond. Marie Osmond, the squarest person on earth. You know, with her brother Donnie, I'm a little bit country and he's a little bit rock and roll. And here is Marie Osmond, who is essentially the resident not getting the joke person. And she is supposed to do a little skit where she introduces this footage, and where and what she's supposed to do is she's supposed to tell you about Hugo Ball, and then she is supposed to recite the first line of the poem. Because, as the producer explained it to me long after this book was published, because there is a reference to this event in this book, just a tiny little reference about Marie Osmond and sound poetry and all of that. I had not seen the show. I'd read about it in TV Guide. When I talk about doing research, I mean serious research. You know, when I see an item in TV Guide that says strange things on this show, which is in fact a compendium of greatest hits of previous shows. A chef who throws food in the air to season it, and something else I don't remember, and poems that have no meaning. Sounds really interesting, with Marie Osmond. So I just stuck that in and riffed off from there. Never bothered to research the show. And after this book came out, I met the producer, or he sought me out, and he gave me a copy of the show. And he said, Marie knew everybody thought she was a bimbo. And so she took this poem and she went home and she memorized the whole poem. And when we put the cameras on her and she was just supposed to say the first line, she proceeded to recite the entire poem. Now, it's not easy to recite a poem filled with words that aren't words. It's like reading the name of someone in, a very difficult, let's say, African or Southeast Asian language that has 17 syllables in it. We don't know how to pronounce those words, even though we can phonetically put them together. We can't hold them in our head. It's very difficult to recite a poem like that. They put the cameras on her, and this is what she did.
When you know you're going to be on stage, you want to make sure that you look your best and that you're properly dressed for the part. Appearance was especially important to a gentleman named Hugo Ball. He was a poet and a leader of an artistic movement called Dada. A hat like this was part of his costume, which looked like this. The number 13 on the cardboard tube that covered his face had nothing or everything to do with his performance. Dada artists didn't claim to make sense, but they did want to make unconventional artistic statements, most of them as a form of social protest. In this case, the statement included waving a small flag while reciting a nonsensical poem. The poem was written and first performed by Hugo Ball in Zurich in 1916. And it remains to this day a classic example of what Mr. Ball called sound poetry. Here's what it sounds like. A totally imaginary language invented by Mr. Ball. Kawani jolifanto blamba o fali hambla. Grossiga me pafla habla hormi gaga gorman. Hai globlo aikora sula huju. Holaka holala. An logobang, blagobang baso futaka. Ooh. Shampa uwala wasa. Olobo. Hechtada gorme sej zumbada. Wulubu susuba de uluwa susuba de tamba. Baumf. Kasagama. Baumf. It didn't make any sense, but it wasn't supposed to make any sense. But nevertheless, Mr. Ball's performance got a rousing ovation and turned out not to be a passing fancy, but a new art form, sound poetry.
So forget about a little bit country and a little bit rock and roll. That is Marie Osmond as all punk. Well, I've been talking for about an hour. I could go on for a lot longer, but that's probably enough. I mean, this is a 500-page book, and you don't really want to be here all night.